Over the months that followed, the king became obsessed with falling in love. He sent orders to have his subjects search the lands, summoning the most beautiful and wise women and men, because even though he'd only ever liked girls before, he really didn't want to limit himself here. He met person after person, but there was never any spark between himself and who he met. Behind their eyes he saw only mistrust and hatred of him. This hurt the king, particularly in those he fancied a bit. Why was it so difficult to find someone to fall in love with him? There were so many people in his kingdom and beyond that surely there must be someone he could meet. Each morning he would wake and look out upon his kingdom and see only other people in love, having somehow never noticed them before. Every day he would walk the grounds of his huge castle alone, in full sight of love all around him, the one treasure that eluded the lonely King Furciel, constantly living and breathing mere feet away from him, and yet eternally out of sight and reach. Soon the months became years, and the suitors and suitoresses continued to come each day. They still brought no love for him with them. The king began to grow old, and his loneliness cut wrinkles across his face, the heaviness in his cheeks causing his lips to droop. It became harder and harder for him to smile. And so the king came to live in resignation, accepting that he would never meet another soul to rescue him from his prison, from his sacrifice. He tried to take comfort in the knowledge that whilst his pain continued, he was free from selfishness, and the imbalance he bore had brought peace and unity to the entire world. But he never could. And then, one day, whilst he was watching a young couple from his balcony and secretly hoping that a giant bird would swoop down and poo on their heads, he noticed a young man approaching the palace. This man, though of course the king didn't know it yet, was a librarian from a faraway land. He didn't come to the palace seeking an audience with the king. He'd merely taken a wrong turn many miles before whilst looking for a clerical position in neighbouring towns, and knocked on the door to ask if they had a telephone he could use. His name was little Toby Taylor. As the king watched him from his turret, he became instantly enchanted with him. There was an evident innocence to the youth which he found charming, to say nothing of singular. He could immediately sense the trust he placed in others, which the foolish mistook for naivety, and the predatorial simply took. As far as the king thought, Toby Taylor didn't see him. But Toby Taylor couldn't take his eyes off the man, instantly conspicuous by his solitude high up on the lonely stone balcony of his tower. This exchange continued when they met face to face. Toby Taylor would intently study every aspect of his being when the king would look away, only to look back to the floor when the man's gaze returned to his, afraid of being mocked for his fascination and habitual instant trust. The king, too, wearily expected to see the same deceit in the younger man's eyes, but the glimpses he stole revealed only honesty, sincerity, and the certainty of an impossibly deep and endless capacity for love. He said he had heard of the king, of course, but saw no reason to dislike someone he'd never met, that he'd lived an isolated life, knowing only of books and little of the real world outside of them. He said at times he had often felt quite lonely. The king gave him a place in the castle library there and then. Little Toby Taylor quickly became the only person he trusted. He knew he would never betray him, he was certain of it. His very presence in the castle engendered feelings within him that had for so long been buried under bitter feelings of suspicion, fear, and the crippling loneliness that such feelings bring, that he was not aware of them at first. Things such as kindness, honesty, a love of the simple things in life. Little Toby Taylor loved nothing more than to sit and watch the sunset, or walk the wide and beautiful orchards of the king's huge garden, talking to birds, trees, and insects alike, reminding them that they were beautiful, and thanking them for sharing their beauty with him. The gardener, and in fact all the king's subjects, thought that the king's new librarian was one seagull short of a seaside, but the king had learnt to care nothing for their scorn over the years. In time, the king found himself walking the grounds once Toby had left them, talking to the animals and plants that grew there, as he had, too afraid to walk with him for fear of invading the young man's privacy. This was how their kinship continued, at a great distance, divided by the many rooms in the king's palace and his fear of his subjects learning of his fondness for the young man, and infecting him with their greed, selfishness, and scorn. It was a warm spring day when it happened. Furciel was watching Toby read from a book of haiku to a ladybird crawling upon his knee in the gardens far below, when suddenly the realization occurred to him, the source of the warmth within him as he watched the young man go about his day, the profound sense of peace and contentment that took hold of him whenever he placed himself near. He was in love. As the startling thought echoed through his mind, Toby Taylor suddenly looked up and, seeing the king watching him from above, smiled up at him. A wave of joy suddenly surged through the weary bones of the king, and he couldn't help but smile back. It was as if he had felt the sunlight upon his face for the first time in decades. Without a word exchanged between them since the first day they'd met, he had fallen in love, and was loved in return. In that moment he realized that all he needed to do was to declare it, and the curse upon him would be broken, and balance would be restored to the world once more. Quickly, the king hurried to his library to scan the small print of the local registry office's charter for any recent addendums on civil partnerships. As he searched the now well-ordered bookshelves and piles of manuscripts, he noticed Toby's few meagre possessions upon the desk where he worked, his coffee cup, his 2 pens and a pencil, that day's newspaper. Furciel smiled as these items brought him comfort, and he was about to walk past them when he noticed something in the newspaper. It was a headline about a young man rescued from a well. He reached for it and began to read the story underneath, an account of how the young man was saved by an entire village. Everyone had abandoned their usual tasks and occupations, butchers, bakers, witches, hermits and trolls, and worked together to help. An entire village united in their efforts to save one life. Furciel smiled as he studied the image beside the article, a fine etching of the young man, who looked very similar to Toby. Suddenly, a horrible thought struck him. In that moment he realized that if he were not king, if there was no selflessness in the world, then the youth would have surely perished. The village would not have abandoned its duties and routines to all work together to help him. But were he to act to restore selfishness and conflict to the world, someone would have lost their love when the young man died. Someone so much like Toby. The king panicked, daring to consider creating a world where he could so quickly take that preciousness away from someone else. He paced frantically as he considered that if he went ahead with his intent, he would not only doom humanity to envy, violence and hatred, but he would destroy love itself, 1,000 times over. Suddenly he didn't know what to do. He locked himself away in his cold and smelly room for hours, desperately trying to decide what the right course of action was. Finally, that evening, he decided. He went down to the library where little Toby Taylor was working, and spoke his first words to him since the first day they'd met. Toby's eyes lit up as he saw him approach. That same smile spread broadly across his lips. Solemnly, King Furciel told him to go. He had waited till the middle of the night before telling him, when it was dark so the young man couldn't see the tears in his eyes as he spoke. Of course he couldn't tell him why. He offered him a small fortune to make sure he wouldn't have to work another day in his life if he didn't want to, but Toby Taylor didn't want his money. He said he hadn't done anything wrong. He said he was being thrown out of the only true home he'd known, the only place he'd ever felt he belonged, and without any reason. He told him that he hated him. He hadn't understood why others hated him so much before, but now he did. And he told him that if he had so much as half a wish, it would be to never see him again. He never did see little Toby Taylor again, nor the bad fairy who had once offered him that fate he had so willingly accepted. As the years moved on, and Furciel came to accept his fate, he reassured himself that his life alone, a life of being hated and scandalized by all, was a worthy life, for his loneliness kept humanity at peace with one another. He told himself his first ever wish had been one of true selflessness, and that he had forgotten this. He had become selfish, like all his people had been before he had become king, a man whose palace was filled with treasures meaningless to him, but desired by all his subjects and citizens, united in their hatred and envy of him, and yet ignorant of the greatest treasure they themselves so freely possessed, the one thing he so desperately sought, his motives so very far away from greed. Despite it all, despite his wealth and his riches, despite the hatred of the people and the freedom with which they spent and abused and wasted their ability to love, it was his loneliness that kept them together. It was the danger to him, every day, that kept them safe. It was the unending pain of his own loss, accepted foolishly so long ago without even a second thought, and the forbidding of him to share his riches with them, that kept them in possession of the greatest treasure of all. Was this brave of him? Was he foolish? Was he selfless or selfish? Was he simply too afraid to change his own destiny, or was he more concerned with preserving the greater destiny of all his people? Was he lonely because of this curse, or was his loneliness always his own? Was he cursed? Was he blessed? Was he truly free? Does he deserve our pity? Did he deserve his people's hatred? Did he do the right thing? And is there a moral beyond? Never accept wishes from strange fairies in forests. Yes, there is. But the milky cups of instant coffee never tell you exactly what's in them, or exactly how they should be drunk. Most people just drink the cup and never really think about it. People always seem to do things like this, just plod along and never really question anything or look at what they have themselves for what it really is. The end. Because many stories need one.